I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and this is Middle East Now. Well, all eyes are on the U.S. presidential elections here in the Middle East as the region prepares for how the outcome may impact their future. As the fighting continues between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, Lebanese locals are voicing hope that whoever is voted in will push for a decisive halt to the ongoing conflict following the current administration's failure to secure a ceasefire deal. And here's what some Lebanese have had to say about today's vote.
First of all, the U.S. election will have a big impact on the situation here in Lebanon, since there are ties between America and Israel. They have continuous communication and continuous U.S. support to Israel. This will surely affect us. First of all, because Trump said that the Lebanese in Michigan have a lot of influence, 250,000 voters. He said that he could stop the war in Lebanon, and he would work on that and push for peace in the Middle East.
This is talk. Whatever America wants happens here. This is what we are seeing. For us to come and speculate about what will happen, only God knows. God willing, it will be good. They are saying that if Trump wins, he will de-escalate the strikes on Lebanon. If that happens, we will be grateful.
I think that since the war escalated in a big way in Lebanon, I would prefer the one who wants to stop the war. The one who would lean towards diplomatic ways, not towards war.
Well, joining us now in the studio is international affairs analyst Dan Perry and public diplomacy advisor Jonathan El-Khouri. All right, let's start with the question that is on everybody's minds. I think that we all know that, the decision that is made today by the American voters is going to have a long-standing impact on the future of the war that we're seeing right now between Israel and the axis of resistance. But if Trump wins the election, how can we expect his policy in the Middle East to impact the ongoing fighting that we're seeing?
The Democrats have been rather acquiescent to disobedience on the part of almost every player involved in this conflict. They have a very grand and great design that they would like to see happen. Israel stands in the way of part of it. Certainly Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran stand in the way of much of it. The idea, I think, is that Trump, should he win, being capricious and impatient and a little bit inclined to simple narratives, might just step in with a hammer and break apart this edifice of pointlessness that we are seeing here for the past year and a half. He might go to Iran and do the very thing that I've been calling for, but which I cannot see Kamala doing, which is to lay down the law and say no more proxies, no more nuclear, not a matter of deals. We will come after you if you don't start behaving. I could see that happening.
But during his leadership, obviously, Iran remained active. It
continued because on the other hand, he's an isolationist and he doesn't want more misadventures, and it didn't seem as urgent back then. And he had to win from his perspective, which I think was a terrible mistake. His win was to walk out of the nuclear deal, and he was kind of done with Iran. Right now, the win would be to put an end to the madness in the Middle East. Now, Israelis think that he's going to be forever acquiescent to the current Israeli government, and that's why we see all this support for Trump in Israel. But they may be in for a surprise, because whereas Trump doesn't care about the Palestinians, doesn't care about humanitarian issues, he also doesn't like to look like a loser who is allowing his allies to do a forever war. He hates forever wars. People talk about how Biden abandoned Afghanistan. No, Biden implemented awkwardly Trump's abandonment of Afghanistan. Trump basically surrendered to the Taliban because they wanted to end that war. Something similar could happen here. In short, Harris's continuity, Trump could be a surprise.
Now, it's interesting because we see so many kind of Western liberal progressive voters in the United States, for example, essentially saying that Harris is the only option for us when it comes to securing a path forward for perhaps a Palestinian state, or really just to end the suffering of Gazans right now amidst the war. But we're kind of seeing a very different rhetoric when it comes to Arab voices across the Middle East, specifically in Lebanon. I mean, we just saw some vox pop, some people speaking on the street and basically giving their input as to what they think would happen if Trump were to be elected, and they overwhelmingly seem to be wanting Trump to win this election. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, for my acknowledgement of the Lebanese culture, a lot of them, also like a lot of the Arabs in the U.S. would support Trump because of conservative issues, because of the way that they look at LGBTQ plus issues, because the way that they look about abortion and stuff like that, that Trump already has announced his affiliation towards that. So a lot of these, you can say, conservative communities look at Trump as in a way that, although they don't agree with him 100%, but they really ally themselves with a lot of his thinking. It happens a lot in Lebanon. You can say that the Arab world, in some sort of way, loves people that are tough, that wouldn't seem weak, and also that will get the respect. And the word respect is much more appreciated here because, in some sort of a way, Trump was the only one, although like you can like it or hate it, was the only one that was able to achieve some sort of peace deal in the Middle East that was in the form of the Abraham Accords. That was something that wasn't done before, although it was already happening underneath the table, but he was the one that uncovered and unveiled it to the whole world with almost 5 Arab countries that created some sort of a peace deal with the State of Israel, with their acknowledgement of the right of the existence of the State of Israel. So a lot of the Lebanese, also because his son-in-law is Lebanese himself, see themselves maybe their, you could say, salvation could come from President Trump because this is kind of, he would whisper in his ears in favor of the Lebanese people.
Right. You know, it's interesting, of course, because obviously we saw this major push from the Biden administration in the final weeks leading up to this election to implement some type of ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hezbollah. That obviously has not happened. The question is, would Trump be able to actually make that happen, especially understanding that Israel, for one, does not trust that Hezbollah is going to follow any type of resolution, as it hasn't in the past. Well, we've seen with UN Resolution 1701 as an example.
Well, I think part of what's being missed in all this talk about how who might force the parties to do a ceasefire is the actual ideological position on the issues. And I think the U.S. does agree with Israel's goal of basically implementing 1559, which is a disarming of Hezbollah and Lebanon regaining control over its own territory. It's an obvious thing to support. There's almost no counter-argument. I'm sure the Lebanese government supports it. If you hear the Prime Minister Mikati speaking between the lines, you know he supports it. I don't think Trump will walk away from that.
He says it out loud.
Yeah, it's incredible courage, which is a reflection of how Israel has degraded Hezbollah,
well,
that they're
Trump
getting up the
might
courage.
not necessarily walk away from that, but the question is whether or not it can actually be implemented.
For this to happen,
because
he would have to bring that aforementioned hammer, and that hammer would largely have to go to Iran, and he would have to make clear that the U.S. is putting all its weight behind the implementation of the Security Council resolutions, and Hezbollah, at the very least, I suspect it'll come to that compromise, moving north of the Litani River and agreeing to never again deploy near the border, and having there be a Western-backed version of the Lebanese army on the border. Things of this nature, I can see it happening, and for this, they'd have to focus. And the Biden administration, I'm sorry to say, despite having great ideas, hasn't been able to pursue them with strength. And as Jonathan was saying, that is at the root of some of this weird sympathy in the Arab world and in much of the world for a version of the U.S. government that puts muscle behind where its mouth is.
Right. Okay, of course, and I know you want to comment on this, but, you know, obviously we just have to speak to the fact, of course, that you know, this would essentially require more American funding, per se. We know that the policy amongst the Republican members of Trump's new government, for example, J.D. Vance, his vice president, very isolationist. They don't want to be putting a lot of money towards foreign issues. They want to focus on domestic policy. And also, generally, you know, the sentiment is that why should the West be involved in our issues in the Middle East as a whole? But do you think the Lebanese feel that way anymore, given what's happening with Hezbollah?
I think the Lebanese are putting their, you can say, salvation towards Israel because they're hoping that Israel would finish the job that it started by hurting Hezbollah that much that they will not be able to achieve their military capabilities again like they were able to do that in 2006 in the previous war. And this is something that also goes back to the question, when will that you can say, ceasefire would be demanded on Israel from the U.S. administration or from the surrounding countries. Because this is the question of when, not the question of if, because we all know that Israel is interested in having a ceasefire with Lebanon, but on what cost? Is the cost that would be that Hezbollah, like was mentioned before, will be pushed northern to the Litani River, but they will be able to gain back their capabilities after they will recover? No, this is something that also has been speaking about inside of the Lebanese politics, inside of Lebanese circles, that they're saying that it's about time that we get Hezbollah's weapons out of the picture. They are 100% sure that they will continue to be a political issue, but they have to not maintain any weapon capabilities. Otherwise, we didn't do anything, and they just suffered for enough. A lot of the Lebanese people are putting their faith in Israel to finish the job with you can say the Islamic Republics of Iran occupation of south of Lebanon, of the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and also in Beirut.
All right, we're going to have to turn right now to northern Israel. Dan, I know that you want to respond to this. We will have a moment to get to that shortly. Multiple barrages of rockets have been fired into Israeli territory from Lebanon throughout the course of the day. And joining us now is our correspondent, Balir Sladin. He's joining us from northern Israel. Balir, what is the latest? Give us a quick update here.
Yes, although that we're talking about a relatively calm day, but 2 hours ago there were sirens in the western Galilee, specifically in Nahariya and other towns in that area. Apparently a large barrage of rockets, 20 to 30 rockets were fired toward that area, but most of them were intercepted, and the rest actually fell in open areas. No damage or casualties as a result of that. Most of the attacks that Hezbollah took responsibility for, and we've heard the sirens also in the towns here in the north of Israel, were in the confrontation line, actually not very far away from the Israeli-Lebanese border. It's just that this morning, apparently Hezbollah fired missiles toward the area of Haifa, but those missiles were also intercepted by the Israeli air defense system, and simultaneously also a drone was intercepted from the east. Right after that, about 45 minutes after that, so at about 8 a.m. This morning, also a siren was heard in the area of Matsada in the Dead Sea, and this is only the third time that we hear the siren in that area. The previous times were only when Iran actually attacked Israel, and this was the third time, but also the IDF is saying that they were successful in targeting and intercepting the drone that was fired toward that area as well. And also in a rare statement today, and I don't know if we could also say rare about that today, because in the past 24 hours, the IDF is taking responsibility for the second time for attacks against Hezbollah infrastructure in Syria, something that happened also last week. And this is becoming more frequent because before the war, or before the escalation, the IDF hasn't been taken official responsibility for such attacks. But today, the IDF is saying that the Israeli Air Force conducted an attack or a strike on a weapons storage facility that belongs to Hezbollah there. And also some reports are talking about an official, Hezbollah official in Syria. His name is Haytham el-Tabtabai. He is the top commander of the Radwan unit in Syria and in Yemen that was killed and assassinated by Israel. Now some of his pictures circulating online alongside people like Hashim Safiuddin that was also assassinated by Israel in Beirut a couple of weeks ago. And maybe if that's true, then this is another achievement for Israel in that area as well.
Right. All right. I'd like to thank you so much for that update, Balir. We're going to be turning now to Iran as the world waits for the outcome of the upcoming U.S. presidential elections. Here in Israel, much of the focus remains on Iran and the potential for another major attack following Israel's retaliatory strikes on Iranian military infrastructure late last month. Now, some analysts say that an Iranian strike could be as early as after U.S. election polls close, and it will likely involve Israel's air defenses being the main targets in this round of the long-range missile war. Well, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke today with Defense Minister Yoav Gallant here in Israel to reaffirm the U.S.'s ironclad commitment to Israel's security against threats from Iran amidst this ongoing threat. Well, joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Benham Ben Talablu, a senior fellow from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. To begin, what kind of attack could we expect from Iran at this point?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. There's been an escalating war of words from Iranian military, political, and even religious officials ever since Israel's successful retaliatory attack against Iranian military installations on October 26th. There was some initial reporting that Iran might be able to try to pivot, to talk tough, but actually have proxy fire be the main vector of a revenge attack. There was a lot of talk about the short-range ballistic missiles that Iran had already moved 6 years ago into western Iraq, constituting the bulk of the firepower against Israel. As you know, there was a series of recently intercepted drone attacks from Iraq, the Iran-backed militias there, against Israel as well. In my view, that could be factored in, meaning you could have a multi-front, multi-directional attack against Israel. But the way Iranian leaders, including most recently the supreme leader, have been making it sound is that they are quite keen on escalating again directly from Iranian territory. Unless we forget there's a whole host of other systems of Iran's 3,000 plus ballistic missile inventory that have not been used yet, that are still capable of reaching Israel if fired from Iranian territory. And so the great fear is there could be some combination of a direct ballistic missile attack. One, unfortunately, as you know, all of Iran's medium-range ballistic missiles are capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. So that signals the potential future threats that the regime could pose. That could be married with a shorter-range proxy attack.
I mean, how imminent is this Iranian threat, in your opinion?
Well, actually, there's two Iranian threats that I want to highlight. There's the imminent kind of land-based attack with precision fire, either from ballistic missiles or drones or cruise missiles from Iran, Iraq, or other proxy-held territory. And that's the latest in this escalating cycle of overt violence between these two countries. But there's also a medium to longer-term threat that we have to keep our eyes on in the aftermath of the election. And that is, as much as Iranian leaders are bloviating and engaging in literally hate speech and hate invective against Israel. That's something kind of classic we've seen sustained for quite a long time now. Within the month of October, there has been an escalating series of commentary talking about going for a potential nuclear option, including two veiled statements by Iran's supreme leader, two high-level advisors to Iran's supreme leader, 3 parliamentarians, 2 hardline newspapers, and even 1 military official, all within the course of 1 month. So there is also the threat of the regime moving in the nuclear direction as well.
At this point, it appears that Iran's strongest proxy groups like Hezbollah have seen most of their capabilities severely diminished. I mean, do you think that Israel still faces a very serious threat from the axis of resistance?
The long-term threat to Israel from the Iran-backed axis of resistance is a political threat, meaning that all of these jurisdictions, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, what have you, are permissive environments for Iran to play on the downtrodden and dispossessed, and to put guns in the hands of people who want to fire at the likes of Israel, America, or someone else. So that's a long-term threat. But with respect to Hezbollah in particular, which has really been the crown jewel of Iran's proxies, I hope the recent reporting, I think by the New York Times and others, about 80% of the arsenal, 50% of the precision strike capabilities of Hezbollah have been depleted. But lest we forget, we've only seen 2 ballistic missiles fired during this entire war by Hezbollah. So as much as I hope those statistics are correct, what has been fired doesn't necessarily correlate with that, which some claim had been destroyed.
All right, Benham, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us with your insight. We're going to be turning to Iraq now. The Iran-backed Islamic resistance militia in Iraq has taken responsibility for launching drones at Israel overnight. The group says that it launched 3 drones at Haifa between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning. The IDF says that it shot down at least 1 drone that entered Israel from the area of Syria. Now, this comes as leaders of Iraq's national Shia movement, is issuing a warning to the Iraqi government not to take part in any initiatives that support a 2-state solution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Muqtada al-Sadr says that Palestine is the only legitimate state, but his remarks have stirred criticism, with analysts saying that he could fuel internal political strife between rival forces in his country. Well, joining us now is former spokesperson to the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq, Intifad Kanbar. So, Intifad, break this down for us. I mean, why are these statements so inflammatory when it comes to internal Iraqi politics, given the mass anger towards Israel, especially in its war against Hamas?
Well, they say all politics are local. Sayyid Muqtada Sadr sees an opportunity to attack anything to attack anything has to do with Israel, to gain momentum and liking possibility by the Iranians after they put tremendous pressure on him and almost overthrew him from the government through a coup d'etat. So unfortunately, this is the politics of the Middle East. People, when they are abandoned, when they are not supported by the United States, when they don't have any support, and Iran hegemony is existing, especially like Muqtada Sadr, he has to sing their song and go against Israel once in a while to keep his position and maintain some sort of immunity.
Now, there have been reports that Iran could be planning on striking back at Israel via its proxy groups in Iraq. What do we know about that at this point?
Well, I've said that many months ago. Iraq, for example, there's a base in Jurf al-Sakhar, southwest of Baghdad, where Iran turned this area after evacuating all the Sunnis from it. Is a desert area now, deserted area now, and they turned it into makeshift to manufacture long-range missiles, ballistic missiles, short-range missiles. And also they have established bases on the border with Jordan and the desert with Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. Therefore, and additionally to that, Iraq became a ground highway, as we call it, the land bridge to pass weapons and fighters to Syria and to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So it's impossible for Israel to have security or set peace in the Middle East without punishing these militias inside Iraq. And we can see these militias are completely getting emboldened. Let me give you a small piece of information. It might surprise you. Those militias, when they target Israel, they submit a bill to the Iraqi government for the price as a price for this attack.
Right.
And the Iraqi government is putting them on payroll and harboring them, giving them IDs and using the Iraqi government vehicles. So I think it's important for the world, the United States, to hold the Iraqi government directly responsible for these terror attacks. And the game that the Iraqi government was trying to speak from one side of their mouth to be friends with the United States and the other side of their mouth to be nice to the militias and pay them money must not continue. It will not continue. And I warned the Iraqi government several times. I don't think Israel is going to stand still, do nothing to these attacks for a very long time. And unfortunately, we may see Iraq slipping into a regional devastating war.
All right, Intifada, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. We are going to be turning now to the ongoing situation in the Gaza Strip. As the humanitarian crisis in Gaza worsens, the U.S. has been increasing its threats to halt arms shipments to Israel. And today, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant held a phone call to discuss Israel's aid efforts to Gaza. Take a look.
Amid fears of a worsening aid crisis in Gaza, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant have discussed the steps Israel has taken to improve the humanitarian situation in the enclave Gaza. The phone call between the two came as the U.S. has been ramping up its criticism over Gaza aid in the last few days.
As of today, the situation has not significantly turned around. We have seen an increase in some measurements. We've seen an increase in the number of crossings that are open. But just if you look at the stipulated recommendations in the letter, those have not been met at this point. So that's a fail. We're not at the end of the period yet. They have not. If you look at what we ultimately judge, what we ultimately judge on, which is the results on the ground, the results are not good enough today.
Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin have sent a letter to Gallant on October 13, warning that failure to address the humanitarian crisis within 30 days could lead to a restriction on U.S. arms shipments to Israel.
We are not at the end of the 30-day period, and we are in conversation. It's not the end of the semester.
The call comes as Israel has been facing backlash over a passed law to forbid the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA. This law bans UNRWA from Israel, which will also restrict the agency's movements in Gaza and the West Bank. Israel says that UNRWA is infiltrated with Hamas terrorists who participated in the October 7 onslaught and who have been using the organization for their own good. The deadline has not been surpassed, but the upcoming US elections could be a game changer, since the Jewish vote won't influence this decision any longer. But if the US chooses to make good on its threats, remains to be seen.
Turning back to our guests in the studio, obviously we know that Israel has banned UNRWA activities in the state of Israel. This is going to have a major impact on their ability to provide aid within the Gaza Strip. What is your take on this?
Well, my take is that Israel did the right thing by banning UNRWA, and they should ban it completely. UNRWA needs to be shut down because UNRWA preserves the idea that the Palestinians would be able to go back and basically eliminate Israel from existence. This is what UNRWA has kept for 76 years, this desire of endless refugees that to my acknowledgement, doesn't exist in any other place in the world, in any other case of refugees in the world. And that's why UNRWA should be ceased to exist. And all the funding, except of going to UNRWA, they need to go to the authorities that will be, at the end of the day, responsible for the people that are living in that territory. Dan, just any comments on kind of what we can expect from, U.S. policy in Gaza post this election?
Well, in Gaza, as elsewhere in the region, we see a situation that is such a mess that it's unsustainable. And much of it comes from Iranian interference, whether it's supporting Hamas and Jihad, the Hezbollah disaster in Lebanon, the Houthis, now militias in Iraq that may fire at Israel. You mentioned before that Trump is, the Republicans are isolationists, and J.D. Vance is pushing in that direction. But I think there's a deal to be done where Trump almost certainly, if he comes to power, will sell out Ukraine. A little sadly for people who don't want Putin to receive a prize. In exchange for that humongous victory from their perspective, I think he'll get leeway to operate in the Middle East.
All right, we're going to be back shortly after a quick commercial break. Jonathan, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Stick with us. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish World Weekly. I'm Khaled Ben David, and each week we're going to bring you the latest from the Jewish world, from politics to religion, entertainment to the latest trends, and everything in between. Join me each week as we explore the global Jewish diaspora. Don't miss Jewish World Weekly only on I-24 News.
Want to stay on top of the news no matter where you are?
Introducing I-24 News' brand new news website.
On our website, you'll find all the latest articles, interviews, and live broadcasts. Everything you need to know right at your fingertips, whenever you want it.
So what are you waiting for? Download the I-24 News app today.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
And we are back on Middle East Now. I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for sticking with us. Well, it's official. Hamas has rejected a proposal for a short-term ceasefire and hostage release deal. That is according to the U.S. State Department following a call with Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdelati. Now, Egypt had put forth a proposal that would have started with an initial 48-hour ceasefire. During that time, Hamas would have prepared for the release of 4 Israeli hostages over the course of the next 10 days. And those 4 hostages would reportedly have been either women, elderly, or sick. In exchange, Israel would have released roughly 100 Palestinian security prisoners. And during that 12-day deal, Israel and Hamas would have held talks about a more long-lasting ceasefire. Well, joining us now is former peace negotiator under Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, Gidi Greenstein. Why has Hamas rejected this deal?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I believe that for Hamas, the issue is that the proposition of Israel is give us the hostages, we'll give you some prisoners, but then we'll continue the war in order to demolish Hamas. And part of the issue is that there is no vision at the moment. Israel is not presenting a vision for the day after. That's why we're looking at a very kind of a small coalition is trying to be built around a small prisoner exchange deal as opposed to a bigger vision. I think the more important aspect of this week, and perhaps a setback, is the failure of Fatah and Hamas to agree on the day after Gaza, and Fatah effectively saying or reporting that Hamas insists on remaining in power in Gaza. For Israel, this means that the war may be extended deeper into the future, and that is obviously tragic for the hostages and their families.
Right. Well, I mean, it was very much expected that meeting, those discussions in Cairo between Hamas and Fatah were essentially for show. We saw a similar meeting, with Chinese mediators, some signed memorandums that nothing came of. The U.S. has consistently blamed Hamas for the standstill in talks. Arab mediators, Qatar and Egypt, have privately maintained that the U.S. is downplaying Netanyahu's responsibility. But the question is really whether or not there's any middle ground here at this point. What will it take to close a deal? What needs to change?
I believe that for Israel, we need to keep on the military pressure on Hamas. There has to be a credible vision for the day after, primarily focusing on northern Gaza. Israel is putting in a tremendous effort in order to weed out Hamas in northern Gaza. This is basically as far as we can go in terms of establishing military control and domination in a specific area. The question is what happens next, whether Israel will be able to hand over northern Gaza to a Palestinian force, to a Palestinian entity, and or an international force that will take over that area and begin the process of the day after. We have to acknowledge that right now the government of Israel has no vision for the day after. And your previous guest spoke about UNRWA. The simple solution for the conundrum of UNRWA is actually to hand over the responsibilities and the budgets of UNRWA to the Palestinian Authority, so that the Palestinian Authority is the one that delivers healthcare and welfare services to the population. But the government of Israel wants to push out UNRWA without bringing in an alternative entity that will provide the services. And that's why we're kind of locked between a rock and a hard place, because without the vision of the day after, a lot of the immediate action is being, the sensibility of the immediate action is being compromised. I just do want to say that I was part of the only Israeli delegation to have negotiated the end of the refugee problem, including effectively the dismantling and the withdrawal of UNRWA. And a lot of the ideas that were discussed 20 years ago are relevant today. And primarily, the key to the withdrawal of UNRWA is to transfer its powers and responsibilities and resources and budgets to the Palestinian Authority. And if Israel is not willing to do that, we're not going to be able to get away to do away with UNRWA.
I mean, how could the outcome of the U.S. presidential elections impact these negotiations, and also what a post-war Gaza plan could look like? We know that obviously Trump, during his presidency, cut funding to the Palestinian Authority. And the question is, if he were to be elected, how could we expect him to essentially act on this?
So basically, I think we should look at it as a two-phase process. First, there is the period between today, effectively today, and January, when Biden is in office. He is effectively the president. He has all the powers of the executive office. and without the constraints that he was under in the last few weeks, which means that he can do significant things. The other thing to watch for is that the Saudi Arabia is leading effectively an effort to create an upgraded Arab peace initiative. So between Biden, who wants to leave a legacy, and the Saudis, who are leading this upgraded Arab peace initiative, Israel may face a situation over a 2-month period. This is a significant period in which there is a new vision that is being put forward for the day after Gaza. And that vision will be based on some principles that are very clear. That Gaza and the West Bank are a single territorial unit, which is one of the founding principles of Oslo. That the Palestinian Authority will be the governing, reformed and upgraded, will be the governing body of Gaza. That the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. That security forces, Palestinian security forces, should be the ones who are on the ground managing Gaza when Israel hands over the responsibility. Of course, security forces that are approved by Israel and by the Americans. So we do have a 2-month window in which significant things could happen. And then we're talking about the next administration. Harris, I believe, initially will be more like Biden. Maybe a little bit more pressure on Israel, but basically it's going to be the same policy for the first few months. She has other big things that she is focused on. I'm not sure she has the ability to change course relative to Biden. But on Trump, we have to remember the following thing. Trump put forward the so-called Trump plan in January 2020, in which he presented a kind of a vision for permanent status. And the precondition for the vision for permanent status that Trump presented is the removal of Hamas from Gaza, which means that actually it's President Trump, if he comes into power, is the one that has a vision for the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I would urge you, your audience to stay tuned, and there could be interesting surprises where Trump basically going to Israel, going to Netanyahu, saying to Netanyahu, Mr. Netanyahu, you co-authored with me the Trump plan. The precondition was removal of Hamas. We're nearing removal of Hamas. Let's go ahead with the plan that you co-created with me.
All right. Well, obviously, Gidi, we're going to have to wait and see who ultimately wins this election. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us, giving us your insight. We'll see what happens tomorrow. I'm going to turn to our international affairs analyst, Dan Perry. I know that you want to kind of respond to what we heard Gidi say there. Well, I mean, I agree with every word he said, basically, and I just want to put an exclamation mark on the fundamental thing. Hamas should be removed from Gaza. For this to happen, there needs to be Arab world pressure like it's never existed before. When the Arab world is upset at the ongoing killing in Gaza, they need to look at Hamas. The killing can end in a second if the hostages are returned and if Hamas hands over the keys. But the problem is, who to? No one could get behind this plan. No one will put pressure on anyone unless Israel unblocks the blockage and says, yes, we want the PA to be returned to Gaza. The fact that Israel does not do this, does not say these words, that is the primary reason for the blockage of a series of events, one triggering the other, that could bring an end to the war. Now, you could say, well, we're at loggerheads because Hamas won't give up, but they won't face pressure to give up. And it will be a forever war unless Israel presents, not a vision is too big a word, agrees to the only obvious outlet, which is the PA reformed, improved, maybe under different leadership, with Israel and the U.S. assisting and guiding and maybe limiting what can happen, but the PA returning to Gaza. This is the be-all and end-all, the beginning point of any plan that leads to an end to the war. So whereas I've been calling on Qatar and Egypt to pressure Hamas, and I would love to see the U.S. go to Tehran and lay down the law with the proxies and the nuclear program and all the rest of it, a lot of pressure needs to be brought to bear on Netanyahu, who is absolutely preventing any progress here by refusing to talk about a day after in Gaza, demonizing the PA in a way that is reckless, considering that whatever peace there is in the West Bank, and there is a version of peace in the West Bank, is due to the PA. It's an outrage. And to think that this is happening because of coalition considerations, and who knows, the government might fall if the extreme right makes good on what may be a bluff to bring down a government if they should say the words PA. People are dying for the government to somehow survive another day. This is immoral. It's an abomination. It's unstrategic. It's downright stupid. And if we embark down this path, the end point of it, I believe, under Biden and Harris and Trump, would be normalization with Saudi Arabia
and the aforementioned grand design with a strategic alliance, including the West, arrayed against Iran. So Israel's leaving a lot of money on the table to satisfy the extreme right in the coalition.
All right. Well, obviously, we're again going to have to wait and see how today's elections play out. We're going to have those results for you all tomorrow. We're turning now to Egypt, where Egyptian journalists and activists have held a protest outside the Journalists Syndicate headquarters in downtown Cairo to voice their objection to the passage of an Israeli warship through the Suez Canal as part of a protest against Israel's ongoing war against Hamas. Now, the demonstration saw a relatively low turnout, which organizers say was largely because they didn't advertise the protest over fear it would be banned by authorities. And joining us now from Cairo is journalist Joost Scheffers. We know that Egyptian public sentiment is largely anti-Israel. So I guess my question for you is, why is there fear about a protest like this being squashed by Egyptian authorities?
Because that's the fear of the Egyptians here, since this has been happening to every possible protest that has been held against Israel, or also in general protesting in Egypt. The current president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, he took over the rule of Egypt after the so-called Arab Spring. He came to power in a military coup, and later on with elections that he won with over 99%. And he knew from the beginning, I need to crash any possible forms of protest. And while in many other Arab countries in the Middle East, there have been protests against Israel and the support of the Palestinians, Egypt didn't see something like that. They orchestrated only one protest that the government allowed to happen, and that protest quickly turned into anti-government songs, anti-government chanting against the rule of President el-Sisi. So there's a fear in Egypt that if they allow any protests to take place, then it can mobilize people against the president. So there's a huge crackdown on any form of protests. And Egyptians know that. Egyptians have seen it before. They know that for voicing your opinion here on Egypt, for getting on the street, whether it's in support of Palestine, whether it's whether it is against Israel or against the president, you will get in trouble.
Now, and this, of course, comes at a time when Egypt appears to be taking the helm when it comes to hostage release and ceasefire negotiations. What does the Egyptian government ultimately hope to gain by securing a deal?
First of all, Egypt hopes that it will become quiet again at its border with the Gaza Strip. Besides Israel, Egypt is the only country that has a border with the Gaza Strip. And for years, Egypt had the same blockade towards Gaza as Israel had. Egypt has been very much against Hamas since President Sisi took over. It's a sworn enemy of Egypt. They're not happy with Hamas there in power, so they try to minimize all the goods that are entering the Gaza Strip through official ways. So first and foremost, Egypt wants peace at its border. But since the war started a bit over a year ago, Egypt deployed lots of military vehicles and equipment towards the border to keep the Palestinians out, because above all costs, Egypt doesn't want to have any Palestinian refugees into its country. So the sooner the war ends, the better for Egypt to have a calm and stable border again, without the risk of refugees at a certain moment possibly fleeing to Egypt.
Now, the final question that I have for you is really just related to the ongoing U.S. elections. We know that Americans are headed to the polls today. How do Egyptians view the U.S. presidential elections and the outcome that the winner could have for Egypt?
So far, it hasn't been really discussed here in Egypt. Egyptians are more busy and occupied with whatever is happening in Israel and Palestine that dominates the news, economical news. Egypt's got a new report from the International Monetary Fund, what's going to happen there. However, a few talk shows had last night and tonight special reporting about the elections in the US. But if you ask any Egyptians, like, who are the two candidates, they will know Trump from his previous time as a president. But probably Egyptians wouldn't know Harris, and it's not really a topic of discussion here about what's going to happen. However, for the Egyptian government on the national level, this is definitely a topic of interest, of course, and Sisi always has been particularly close with former US President Trump. Trump even called Sisi once his favorite dictator. And that's a compliment, so to say, that Sisi never forgets. So there's definitely some interest from that side to see what's going to happen. But among the average Egyptian on the streets, the US elections are a non-topic. Because in their point of view, whatever is happening in Gaza at this moment and in Lebanon, the world is doing nothing, and the US should do more in their opinion. So they're taking a step back from anything related news or anything coming from the US.
Interesting. All right. Well, Yossi, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us, giving us your insight there. We're going to be turning to a different topic now. Top American and Saudi officials have reportedly held talks in Washington about a possible security agreement that would not end up normalizing ties between the kingdom and Israel. A peace deal has really been all but shelved amid the ongoing Gaza war, with the current Israeli government refusing to even discuss the possibility of a future Palestinian state. And I'd like to turn to our international affairs analyst, Dan Perry, on this. I mean, what would this essentially mean for Israel if the U.S. and Saudi Arabia were to sign security deals right now without Israel's involvement, or at least future plans with Israel being considered?
The deal wouldn't be against Israel. The deal would be in favor of Saudi Arabia, and it would, again, be a sort of signal to Iran. So I think Israel would maybe see itself as a member in waiting of this arrangement. But if Saudi got the deal without having to pay anything in the currency of normalization with Israel, that may disincentivize them to then go for that. Because Saudi Arabia basically wants the deal with the U.S., and the normalization was meant to be the price they pay. I think it would kind of be unfortunate for the Saudi Arabians for the U.S. to give them that before they can extract the grander alliance. But if that happens, again, it's not bad, but it's not less good than it could have been. It would be yet another price that Israel's paid for its inability to put together anything resembling a strategic program for the region and for itself.
Yeah, well, and ultimately, you know, this is a tool that, or at least something that Trump has been saying, you know, that he'll be able to essentially ensure once he becomes president, if he is reelected, his close relationships with Gulf Arab states, his ability to pursue the Abraham Accords even further. But again, we're going to have to wait. We're speaking about the elections right now. Dan, don't worry, I'm coming back to you shortly. Voters are heading to the polls, like we've said, for the 15th time today in the U.S., where they're going to decide on a very tight race between former President Donald Trump and current U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris. Our Emmanuel Honorat has all of the details for you.
A race to the finish line. Presidential candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump used whatever they had left up their sleeves on the last day of their campaigns, one sounding a little darker than the other.
November 5th, 2024 will be Liberation Day in America. And on day one, I will launch the largest deportation program of criminals in American history. We're going to get them out. We have to.
And Harris promising a brighter future.
And tonight, then we finish as we started, with optimism, with energy, with joy, knowing that we, the people, have the power to shape our future, and that we can confront any challenge we face when we do it together.
The candidates closed their campaigns echoing two contrasting realities for the future they each lay ahead. Both focused majorly on Pennsylvania, a state that holds 19 electoral votes and that could decide the election. Crossing across the swing state, Harris made one final push by courting the Puerto Rican vote with other Democratic household names at her side, the squad's U.S. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. And perhaps in a last-ditch effort to prove wrong those who are now concerned by his age, Trump went on a tri-state tour from North Carolina to Pennsylvania before finishing with a midnight rally in Michigan, where he hopes to pick up the votes of Arab Americans shunning the current administration over its support for Israel.
You know, when Winston Churchill, who's a great speaker, he was actually a stutterer, a tremendous stutterer, and he became one of the greatest orators. But when Winston Churchill made a mistake, he didn't go, excuse me, and go back. He just blazed through it. But if I do it, they say he's cognitively impaired.
With the voting underway, Americans and the rest of the world are watching the tight rope that the soon-to-be leader of the free world will have to navigate.
All right, we're going to be turning to our correspondent, Nicole Tzedek, who is joining us from Jerusalem. Nicole, what are we hearing from Israelis today? Who do they want to see win?
Well, I've been speaking to a lot of Israelis throughout the day, and a majority of them have been putting their support for Donald Trump. However, we aren't one of the only watch parties, actually, throughout Jerusalem. Right here, it's Mike's Place. And I'm joined by the owner of Mike's Place Jerusalem, Udi Kaniel. Udi, this is a quintessential American joint. You can see it by all of the decorations that are around us is all. But as we're talking here about exactly who Israelis, Americans might want to see, that's not necessarily the purpose of this watch party for you.
Well, for us at Mike's Place, the purpose of this party is to celebrate democracy and to enjoy this fabulous night. And, you know, may the best man or woman win, obviously. We prepared with, you know, cake and special cocktails.
You have a special Trump and Kamala cocktail that people can order.
Exactly, and that's how we celebrate. That's, you know, we're all about making this a fun and a time for people to connect and, you know, yell at the TVs all night long.
And you've had one of these watch parties several years ago. It got pretty rowdy, correct?
It was a lot of fun. Rowdy is an understatement. It was a ton of fun. We did it 8 years ago, and we enjoyed it a lot, and we said we were going to do this again.
So we'll see exactly as more people do start to come out here to Mike's Place in Jerusalem. But that's the real message that Udi's trying to share right now, Natasha, because as we're talking about these elections, they are so divisive. Here in Israel, they're a little bit less divisive, as the majority of the polls do show that about 66% of Israelis would prefer Donald Trump versus just 17% would prefer Kamala Harris. But still, that's not a place right here to really be talking about those numbers. I do want to note, though, for all of the Americans that do show up here, there are a lot of Americans who have already cast their ballot, who live here in Israel, voting in the United States. There's an estimated 500,000 Americans living in Israel who are eligible to vote. And so for any of those Americans who might be anxious this evening, wanting to watch the polls and the numbers come in with a large, rowdy crowd, they're welcome to come down here to Mike's Place in Jerusalem, because it's going to be a long night, not just in the United States, but certainly here in Israel as well.
All right, Nicole, thank you for that insight. Obviously, a lot of watch parties across the country, not just at Mike's Place, really many venues across Tel Aviv where we are right now. People are gathering. You know, it really is an exciting night, you could say. I'm going to turn back to our international affairs analyst, Dan Perry here. Everyone is on the edge of their seat in Israel, across the Middle East, obviously in the United States. I want your final prediction as to who you think is going to win tonight and whether or not you think that candidate will be better or worse for the state of Israel.
I can't predict who's going to win. I mean, I don't even believe the polls, because the polls are jacking up Trump's support to account for the fact that they previously undercounted his support. So I'm not even sure it'll be that close. We just don't know. My only predictions are basically that if Trump loses, he won't concede and he'll fight it in court. And if Trump wins, then there's big trouble for Ukraine and for Volodymyr Zelensky. But look, this is a very, very exciting election. Whichever way it goes, either we have the first woman president, who's also the first president in a long time who never won a party primary, and it's quite exciting, not to mention a second president who isn't white. If Trump wins, we have the delayed re-election of a convicted felon who's twice impeached and who says he loves dictators and wants to be one. It's beyond belief interesting. Now, there's a lot of trepidation domestically about what Trump would bring if he wins. But the really interesting story, I think, is international. If you look at U.S. history, there hasn't been a discernible difference between the two parties overall. There's been sort of a global consensus. Some even call it the global liberal consensus between the two parties since World War II. The institutions that the U.S. helped build, from NATO to the IMF to the World Health Organization, that basically kept the peace and maintained prosperity. Everyone supported this from both sides. Even on the Vietnam War, the two parties weren't that far apart. Incredible. Now, there really is a difference on foreign policy also. And it's rather amazing. We mentioned Ukraine. That is binary. If Trump wins, that whole narrative changes, and Putin is going to be rewarded, and a lot of people are right to be concerned about that. But on the Middle East, as we said, he's so capricious and unpredictable that who knows what will happen. And I think the Israeli right wing is celebrating a bit too soon, but then again, they may be right, of course, because Trump doesn't care about the Palestinians. But the real issue is, I think, the edifice of nonsense and chaos in the Middle East has become so profound, so implausible, and so unsustainable that even though I personally can find little to celebrate in the Trump re-election, I do admit that the idea of someone coming in and potentially breaking heads will have appeal to people across the board in creating some surprising allies between a lot of people in Israel who see that the current situation is going nowhere, and Lebanese who want someone to lay down the law with Iran in order to get rid of Hezbollah at long last. So no matter what, this skepticism and the cynicism that we're all the same and everything, nothing matters, and all politicians are the same somehow, is wrong, because this has impact, and it's genuinely fascinating.
I agree. It is absolutely fascinating. I mean, just what we were speaking about with Jonathan earlier today, which is that, you see progressive, leftist, liberal Kamala Harris supporters saying that voting for Harris is the only way forward for the Middle East, and then Lebanese locals stuck in the middle of war who are saying they want Trump. They think he's going to solve the situation. Fascinating. But that is it for now. We're going to be back tomorrow with continued coverage of the ongoing U.S. election. Thank you for joining us on Middle East Now. Thank you, Dan. I'm Natasha Kirchak. We'll see you tomorrow.
Shalom. ¿Qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
Want to stay on top of the news no matter where you are?
Introducing I-24 News' brand new news website.
On our website, you'll find all the latest articles, interviews, and live broadcasts. Everything you need to know right at your fingertips, whenever you want it.
So what are you waiting for? Download the I-24 News app today. Welcome to this special edition of the Rundown on I-24 News. I'm Khaled Ben David. We are shifting focus today away from Israel for the most part to an event in the U.S. that may well determine the course of events in this country, in this region, and the entire world, the 2024 presidential election. Americans, of course, are going to the polls now to decide whether Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris or former Republican President Donald Trump will succeed Joe Biden in the White House come January 20th. In the meantime, though, we have major breaking news coming out of here in Israel. And let's go into studio with me, our correspondents, Zach Anders, our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Osran. And Ariel, on a day when the world's eyes are looking elsewhere, Prime Minister Netanyahu has decided to fire the defense minister, Yoav Gallant.
Yeah, Kalev, I don't think it's coincidence picking this timing for such a dramatic decision when Israel is in the midst of a multi-front war. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu firing Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. That's according to a statement issued by Netanyahu's office. The next defense minister is expected to be current foreign minister Israel Katz. The next foreign minister expected to be Gideon Sa'ar, the new addition to Netanyahu's coalition. Now, in the statement issued by the PMO, it included explanations of how in recent months there have become growing disagreements between Netanyahu and Gallant in managing the war. We know that there are many disagreements on the part of Defense Minister Gallant, who even issued a letter to Netanyahu in recent weeks saying that the current war is being handled or being led without an updated compass, without an updated moral compass. This, again, also not the first time Prime Minister Netanyahu firing Defense Minister Gallant. This happened last March, and that took out tens of thousands of Israelis to the streets in protest. Now, also in a time of war, also on the eve of the much anticipated American elections, this is expected, or I think one of the goals of the timing is to prevent such images from reoccurring, what we saw last March. But at the end of the day, dramatic decision coming as Israel, again, is for over a year engaged in a multi-front war.
But we have to point out, this comes, yes, they've had disagreements for months now, but it comes, first of all, after a number of successes, really striking successes by the defense establishment, of course, against Hezbollah, taking out of Hassan Nasrallah, the so-called Pages, however you want to describe it, operation. Of course, holding off against that Iran attack and coming just perhaps on the eve of another Iran attack. So it's really striking that it is coming out. And by the way, we should also mention there may be some domestic politics here, because it comes as some members of his Likud party are threatening to vote against a bill that would restore some funding to ultra-Orthodox young men who serve in the army, a bill that may be key to Prime Minister Netanyahu's political survival. Yoav Gallant had already said he was going to vote against or not support that bill.
Look, Yoav Gallant is not the only element in the coalition who voiced opposition to this current bill, but he's the only one who is being kicked out the door for perhaps also that, as you're mentioning. But really, in the statement, the Prime Minister highlighting the disagreements, saying that you can't manage a war under such conditions. We're seeing, but this is really leading to a dramatic reshuffling of the top tier of Netanyahu's coalition, a new defense minister, a new foreign minister coming at a very volatile period for Israel.
Right. Response from one of the opposition leaders, Benny Gantz, of course, himself a former chief of staff and defense minister. Politics at the expense of national security. Politics at the expense of national security. And Zach, the timing of this coming on a day when internationally, when this might have been a big headline internationally, it's certainly not going to be internationally, and maybe even locally we'll have to share headlines coming on election eve. So tomorrow, of course, the world's going to be focusing more on the results, the world at least, of the U.S. election.
You know, this is one of the most remarkable things I think I've seen here, is the moment captured the Prime Minister. This is whichever way you want to look at it, it is a brilliant move to distract because, there's an adage in journalism, the press releases that come out on Friday, that's take out the trash day because people aren't going to be reading the newspaper on Saturday and Sunday. Or you try and fold it underneath other major breaking world news, other major events. You're right. This is an incredible moment.
But also there would have been some concern by the Biden administration, which has had a very good rapport with Yoav Gallant, saw him as a sort of its main interlocutor, I think, in the Netanyahu government. And again, the Biden administration is going to be dealing with a lot of other issues today and tomorrow, and perhaps that may have been a factor in the timing.
How many times has the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, come and exclusively held one-on-one meetings with Yoav Gallant in the last 2 months and not met with Prime Minister Netanyahu? The U.S. has had a very close relationship with Gallant. I've personally known some of the staffers around Gallant. They have very close relationships with their American counterparts. They travel to America. And this, I think, is going to be a jolt in the system. One of the things I would be curious to know in these coming hours is the American side, did they see this coming, and do they have an approach or some sort of idea of how they're going to handle this transition and working with a new defense minister? Because that's a very intertwined relationship that takes place between an Israeli defense minister and the Pentagon, the State Department, and how they coordinate things like weapons deliveries and plans for
Well, I'm going to say
Lebanon.
a lot of things may be shaken up over the next couple of days in the U.S.-Israel relationship. So let's get back to, again, we'll come back to this later in this program. So this is a huge political story in Israel, beyond politics, of course. It's a huge national security story. We will come back to this later in the program. But let's go to, of course, the main story, internationally at least, certainly the main story of the day, and that is the U.S. presidential election taking place today. Now, of course, most surveys show Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris and former Republican President Donald Trump running neck and neck, both nationally, but even more crucially, in most of the key swing states that will decide the election. Emmanuel Honora takes a look at the last final push by both of the campaigns heading into today's voting.
A race to the finish line. Presidential candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump used whatever they had left up their sleeves on the last day of their campaigns, one sounding a little darker than the other.
November 5th, 2024 will be Liberation Day in America. And on day one, I will launch the largest deportation program of criminals in American history. We're going to get them out. We have to.
And Harris promising a brighter future.
And tonight, then we finish as we started, with optimism, with energy, with joy, knowing that we, the people, have the power to shape our future, and that we can confront any challenge we face when we do it together.
The candidates closed their campaigns echoing two contrasting realities for the future they each lay ahead. Both focused majorly on Pennsylvania, a state that holds 19 electoral votes and that could decide the election. Crossing across the swing state, Harris made one final push by courting the Puerto Rican vote with other Democratic household names at her side, the squad's U.S. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. And perhaps in a last-ditch effort to prove wrong those who are now concerned by his age, Trump went on a tri-state tour from North Carolina to Pennsylvania before finishing with a midnight rally in Michigan, where he hopes to pick up the votes of Arab Americans shunning the current administration over its support for Israel.
Now, when Winston Churchill, who's a great speaker, he was actually a stutterer, a tremendous stutterer, and he became one of the greatest orators. But when Winston Churchill made a mistake, he didn't go, excuse me, and go back. He just blazed through it. But if I do it, they say he's cognitively impaired.
With the voting underway, Americans and the rest of the world are watching the tight rope that the soon-to-be leader of the free world will have to navigate.
Well, for more, let's go to journalist Mary McAuliffe, who joins us from a voting station in Fairfax, Virginia. Mary, I don't know how it is by you, but we have been hearing reports, certainly, of long lines and high voter turnout in certain areas there of the U.S. And how may that impact on the race? Who might that benefit? I guess depends some ways depending on where that's going to happen.
Absolutely, Kalev. Here in Virginia, we're not seeing some of these long lines. In some areas we are. This is a pretty solidly Democratic district that has historically been Democratic for the last several rounds of elections. So Virginia is not a battleground state, but some say it could very well be a bellwether state. Some Virginia, depending on when these election results will come in. Joe Biden won this election in 2020, that he won this state by 7:30. That's just 30 minutes after these polls closed. But Hillary Clinton, it was well past 11 when these results came in, the first sign of trouble. So though while candidates might not have been focusing as much on Virginia, all eyes are certainly looking here to see how exactly this will go. It could be either very good news for Kamala Harris if these results come in later, or also very good news for the Republicans if, on the other hand, it is a closer race to call. Could give us some indication about some of these other races. But we are seeing very strong turnout numbers in some of the key battleground states, especially Philadelphia. Michigan, the Secretary of State within the past hour said that state is on track to break the voter turnout numbers and is just 1 o'clock here in Eastern time. So we certainly have hours to go before all these polls close. But so far, we are seeing a solid turnout. Whether that solid turnout will be good for the Democrats as it was in 2020, or whether this time it will benefit the Republicans, does remain to be seen.
Right. And let's look at, like I said, the polls have basically shown really a dead heat. Voting turnout is crucial. Some have wondered if there might be a late, I won't call it a surge, but a slight advantage to Harris and women voters coming in. Others say Donald Trump, Pennsylvania, which could be a key state. He seems to be holding a slight advantage. So let's talk about that, those sort of final glitches like in the polls going into today.
Absolutely. Well, also some of the analysts that we've been looking at, we continue to heed the message that was learned in 2016. The polls do not always give a full picture. That was slated to be a record election for Hillary Clinton. Of course, that was not what ended up happening. The question is whether or not 2020 is an anomaly year. Of course, we had record early voting numbers. I think the early voting also is going to be key. Republicans seem to have gotten the message that early voting can significantly benefit them. And rather than it just being a democratically led field, the Republicans have really been trying, especially in Pennsylvania, to get their votes in early. However, we won't begin to know the votes from Pennsylvania maybe as early, not until tomorrow, because they don't begin to even count or process some of these votes until way after the polls close, unlike some other the swing states, which we might have early indications about how things could be going as soon as 8 p.m. once polls do begin to close and we begin to see some of those final results. For example, in Georgia, North Carolina, if either candidate has a commanding lead in one of those states, it could, again, give a good indication about how the rest of the states are going to go. But all signs right now could also point that these last minute pushes might not be revealing as we thought they might be. But we have to wait until those polls actually close to see how things will turn out.
All right, Mary McAuliffe there in Fairfax, Virginia. Thank you for that, Mary. And Mary mentioned that was a solidly Democratic district. Let's go now to, you could call it ground zero for the Trump Republicans, West Palm Beach in Florida, of course, home territory of former President Donald Trump. And our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim, is joining us from there, Mike. And Mike, let's talk about that. We were just in Virginia, Democrat, or that area, Virginia, Democratic territory. You're in Republican or even Trump County, I might say. How confident or not do you think are Republicans in the Trump camp going into today or throughout the day?
How times have changed, Kalev. Just a short while ago in history, we couldn't really say Florida was a Republican state. It was among those swing states, but this is not the old time anymore. We're actually right in front of the Palm Beach Convention Center, where Trump is expected to make an appearance later on tonight. This will be the watch party site for his supporters and for the media, and we'll go in a short while as well. Florida's not up for grabs tonight. Trump voted today. We don't even really need to count up the votes, but in terms of how things go from here, so much, Kalev, is going to be determined not on this policy or on that policy. Most people, the overwhelming majority of people, made up their minds long ago. But the get out the vote operation is going to be so critical throughout the day. And unfortunately for the Republicans and for Trump, he didn't invest much in the get out the vote operation. There was money invested in many other areas, but not so much that. It was outsourced to advocacy organizations like Turning Point USA and other outside entities and consultants. Democrats, meanwhile, for decades now, have had, going back to Obama and even before that, have had this machine, they call it, the get out the vote machine, down to the micromanaging which door to knock on to find out if that low propensity voter that they were able to track down has voted on election day. That is going to make a huge difference when the final numbers come in, I think more so than any other difference in policy, especially when we're talking about these razor-thin margins in those battleground states and even into the battleground districts that could decide not only the presidential election, but also control of Congress as well.
All right, Mike, we'll come back to you a little later in the program as, of course, this evening develops, or the day develops there in the U.S., but here in the evening in Israel, we're following another major political story, and that is the sudden, I would say, shock dismissal. Shocking not because it happened, but because of the timing. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu giving Defense Minister Yoav Gallant the boot just moments ago. We do have now a video statement from the Prime Minister on that. Let's take a listen.
In the midst of war, more than ever, complete trust is required between the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister. Unfortunately, although there was such trust and very productive work during the first months of the campaign, over the past months, that trust has fractured between me and the Defence Minister. Significant gaps emerged between Gallant and me in managing the campaign, and these gaps were accompanied by statements and actions that contradicted government and cabinet decisions. I made numerous attempts to bridge these gaps, but they only widened. They also became public in an unacceptable way, and worse, they reached our enemies, who took comfort and gained much advantage from this. In light of this, I decided today to end the Defense Minister's tenure. I have chosen to appoint Minister Israel Katz to the position. Israel Katz has already proven his abilities and contribution to national security as Foreign Minister, Finance Minister and Intelligence Minister for 5 years, and not less importantly, as a long-standing member of the Security Cabinet. Additionally, I spoke today with Minister Gideon Saar and offered him to join, along with his faction, the coalition, and take on the role of Foreign Minister.
And Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has responded to his firing in a tweet, saying simply, the security of the state of Israel has been and will remain my life's mission. That's Yoav Gallant. Ariel, maybe let's take a look at the Prime Minister's statement there. He did not actually, he said there had been trust, interesting, and that had deteriorated because of differences over, there had been gaps in their approach to the war, but he didn't say in what area. And he even made the claim that a lot of people were going to look at, saying that that gave comfort and advantage to the enemies. Let's try to parse what the Prime Minister was referring to there.
Look, Kalev, I think the timing may be surprising, but the decision isn't, because it was already made over 18 months ago when he fired him for the first time. He had to backtrack and has since been waiting for the opportunity to carry that out. This decision, the joining of Gideon Saar to the coalition, was the first signal that this shift was expected to happen. So while the timing is surprising, I don't think anyone in Israel is surprised that this ended up happening. Right. And I think also in the Pentagon, the main partner of Gallant, they saw Gallant as the address in discussions with Israel during this war. I don't think they were surprised there. I think the timing definitely very surprising. What Netanyahu said, look, so this lack of trust between the two started even before the war, and this was an underlying tension throughout this war. In recent months, given the stagnation of the negotiations to end the war in Gaza and bring back the hostages, the spat between Netanyahu, Gallant, and the other top of heads of Israel's security establishment, Ronen Bar from the Shabak and Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff of the IDF, that disagreement became more and more public, and to a certain point, with that converging with Netanyahu's political needs for passing this law that exempts ultra-Orthodox from serving in the military, really brought these tensions to a boiling point, which now we're seeing the repercussions of that. And as far as what happened last time Gallant was fired, it was hundreds, tens of thousands took to the streets. It was called the Eve of Gallant. Now the managers, the heads of the protest movement are calling for people to take to the streets for what they call the second Gallant night.
Right, and we'll see if they come out in those same numbers, Zach.
You know, I just got a text from a source I trust about this. Lebanon coming to a close. This source is saying Lebanon was Gallant's war. He wanted to go there first. He pushed for the shift to the north and was counter-briefing Bibi. Now Lebanon is basically done, and I guess it's time to draw a line.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, let's go to our correspondent in northern Israel near the Lebanese border, Balir Sladin. And, of course, Balir, another day of fighting in the north. But the headlines here are about the firing of Yoav Gallant and how that example may impact on Israel's campaign in the north and against Hezbollah, because, as Zach said, this was something apparently that Yoav Gallant had pushed for, and how this may impact the situation there.
Yes, exactly. This is happening while the war here is intensifying, and also while we are waiting for a response from Iran. So maybe this is going to happen in the coming days, and we have a new security or defense minister in office that needs to learn all the data, all the details, all the information about the system and how it works. And yet the Prime Minister of Israel is deciding to actually fire the current defense minister. This is happening also while Gallant today actually was talking to soldiers from Igo's unit that operates also here in the north, and telling them that we are in need, actually. So the IDF is in need of at least 7,000 new soldiers, and that's the order that Gallant gave in order to recruit as many Haridis, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, as possible. And knowing that there are some people that speculated that this decision is not based on any personal, any security assessments or any security interest of Israel, but actually because of political decisions. And of course, that's something that should be dramatic. Now, I'm here in the north, and while we're talking about this front, this news about the firing of the defense minister is also being discussed in Lebanon and many other areas in the Middle East. And people in Lebanon, from what I understand, are cheering because of that. They are considering that as an achievement, because the Prime Minister has said that Gallant has failed, or at least wasn't able to reach that, or at least hinted that he wasn't able to reach that ultimate victory that Prime Minister Netanyahu always talks about. So they are cheering for that as well. This will definitely affect the situation here. Not sure whether that's going to be positive or negative, but of course we're talking about a very serious situation here, where a new defense minister is getting into office while we're talking about a war with 7 fronts, actually an intense war here in the north. Of course, the continuation of the war in the Gaza Strip, and definitely with this upscale of drone attack that come from the Iraqi militias, and ultimately the most important thing maybe the anticipated strike from Iran as well.
Indeed, which could come as early, some people even speculated it could come even as early as this evening, or certainly in the next few days. So this is, again, cheers in Lebanon over the firing of Yoav Gallant, Balir Sladin, near the Lebanon border in northern Israel. Thank you for that. And drawing the two big stories of this evening together, the U.S. election will impact almost immediately on Israel in this region. And for one thing, the outgoing Biden administration will be able to take steps without worrying about their possible impact at the ballot box. Now, one of those measures could be to follow through on an earlier warning that the U.S. may restrict arms shipments to Israel if it does not significantly boost the amount of humanitarian aid being distributed in Gaza. A 30-day U.S. deadline to see that happen is approaching, and officials in Washington are reminding Israel not to take that lightly. Lynn Plachmeyer has more.
Amid fears of a worsening aid crisis in Gaza, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant have discussed the steps Israel has taken to improve the humanitarian situation in the enclave Gaza. The phone call between the two came as the U.S. has been ramping up its criticism over Gaza aid in the last few days.
That as of today, the situation has not significantly turned around. We have seen an increase in some measurements. We've seen an increase in the number of crossings that are open. But just if you look at the stipulated recommendations in the letter, those have not been met at this point.
So that's a fail.
We're not at the end of the period yet. They have not. If you look at what we ultimately judge, what we ultimately judge on, which is the results on the ground, the results are not good enough today.
Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin have sent a letter to Gallant on October 13, warning that failure to address the humanitarian crisis within 30 days could lead to a restriction on U.S. arms shipments to Israel.
We are not at the end of the 30-day period,
Okay,
and we
so
are in
conversation. Not ready to give them
it's not the end. It's not the end of the semester.
The call comes as Israel has been facing backlash over a passed law to forbid the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA. This law bans UNRWA from Israel, which will also restrict the agency's movements in Gaza and the West Bank. Israel says that UNRWA is infiltrated with Hamas terrorists who participated in the October 7 onslaught and who have been using the organization for their own good. The deadline has not been surpassed, but the upcoming U.S. elections could be a game changer, since the Jewish vote won't influence this decision any longer. But if the U.S. chooses to make good on its threats, remains to be seen.
And again, we are following these two stories. Of course, the U.S. election day and the really shock announcement just about a half hour ago exactly that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has fired the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Stay with us. We're going out for a brief break. We'll follow up on both these continuing stories when we're back.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
back to this special edition of the Rundown on I-24 News. Of course, we are focusing on U.S. Election Day as Americans go to the polls to choose either Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris or former Republican President Donald Trump. But we're also following a major political development here in Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, just a little over a half an hour ago, firing the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, replacing him with Foreign Minister Israel Katz. Getting back to the U.S. election, among those taking part in today's vote are also the hundreds of thousands of American citizens who live in Israel. Some of those are still registered in those key swing states that will decide the race. Our correspondent Nicole Tzedek is in Jerusalem. She's at a popular hangout for American Israelis there in Jerusalem. Tell us about that and what you've been hearing there in Jerusalem today from these American Israelis.
Well, Kalev, there's an estimated 500,000 eligible Americans who can vote right here in Israel, and many of the people that I have spoken to, they did want to take the time to cast their absentee ballot. They even mailed it several weeks ago. So the majority of the people that I had spoken to, they have already voted. And so that's why some of the election parties that we're seeing, like, as you mentioned, at this quintessential American joint here in Jerusalem, Mike's Place, it's really just about coming together despite all of the divisive politics that we're seeing in the United States. That's not the point here. I want to bring in the owner of Mike's Place, Udi Kaniel, who's with me right here. Udi, we see the American vibe, the American flag, Uncle Sam right here as well. It seems like everything we're seeing in the United States is very divisive, but that's not the message you're sharing tonight.
Well, the message here at Mike's Place, of course, is inclusive and everyone is welcome, and we're here to really celebrate democracy. And we prepared for that special stuff like our beautiful cake and the Kamala and the Donald cocktails, obviously red and blue. Those will be served throughout the night with a just inclusive kind of atmosphere, and everyone's welcome. And we really, really want to celebrate this in a positive and inclusive way.
And as everyone in the United States is waiting up late, it's even later here in Israel. We're not even expecting to have an inkling of any sort of results until well past midnight, but you guys will be open, and that's when you're expecting it to be the most crowded.
Yeah, we're starting Israel time at midnight, and we're going to go all the way until way into the sunrise, and we're going to hopefully have a very, very great night.
And it's just a beautiful message, really, Kalev, because when you do hear the politics back home being so divisive, seeing here in Israel, it is a little bit less divisive. I can tell you some of the most recent Hebrew media polls, when they're talking about exactly who Israelis do want to see in the White House next, we're looking at 66% polling say that they want another Donald Trump presidency versus 17% that say Kamala Harris. But either way, as Udi said, it's about democracy tonight, and many of the people here, as I mentioned, they've already voted, so they're not even heading to the polls because they're here in Israel. But whatever happens in the United States has a big impact here in Israel as well, and so that's why so many people are expected to come out and watch as those numbers do start to trickle in.
All right. Well, at least there's going to be some kind of unity there at Mike's Place tonight, Nicole. I'm not so sure about whether that unity will extend across, for example, the U.S. and voters in America. Nicole Tzedek there at Mike's Place in Jerusalem. And for more on the election, we're being joined now by Mark Melman. He's the president and CEO of the Democratic Majority for Israel. He joins us from Washington, D.C. And we have another Mark Zell. He is the co-chair of Republican Overseas Israel, and he joins us from Jerusalem. Gentlemen, first I want to start by asking you how confident you are going into today and why, and where might be your areas of concern. I'll start with Mark Zell.
Well, thanks, Kalev. My main concern at the moment is the kind of thing that we're seeing in some of the swing states now where we've had some irregularities so far. Many of our, for example, in a number of counties in Pennsylvania, are ballots that that were sent here by our voters are being challenged in the counties, and they're even trying to hold a hearing about these challenges on Shabbat. And there have been other problems in other counties in Pennsylvania with voters who are not being able to cast their votes because of alleged backlogs and so on. Anyway, this year, as opposed to 2020, we're on top of this stuff, and we have a great team of lawyers and poll watchers working in Pennsylvania and the other swing states, and we're catching a lot of this, and we're glad that also the courts are being more receptive to protecting the vote. And so that's my main concern. The other thing I have to say is that, we have close to 500,000 eligible voters here in Israel, and we reached out to I guess we would call a virtual door knocking for well over 300,000 of them. And the response here has been unbelievably overwhelming in terms of wanting to vote from all over. We have voters from literally every one of the 50 states, and they've cast their votes. And despite all of the logistical problems that we have in getting the votes, the people registered and getting their ballots and getting them off to the United States, people have really been very, very creative and very persistent, and I give them a lot of credit. So it's been fantastic, I have to say, just watching the democratic process work here.
Same question to Mark Mellman about confidence, and you may address some of the issues that were raised by Mark Zell there as well, Mark. And let's leave the Jewish vote in the U.S. for the side, and just, let's talk more generally, and then we'll get to that in the next question.
Sure. Look, no reasonable person can be confident about the outcome of this election. It is poised on the knife's edge. It is very close. Every poll shows it very close. Every poll in swing states shows it very close. All the simulations and the forecasting models show it very close. This is very likely to be a very close election. Nobody at this moment, before we have a single vote counted, could possibly be confident about the outcome. Having said that, it's clear to me that Mr. Zell is very inconfident, whatever, in his candidate and in their success, because he's doing a real disservice to democracy by already challenging, suggesting that this is not a free and fair election. This is a free and fair election that's being held in the United States. There are no irregularities. The things that he cites as irregularities are, in fact, regularities. There's a process. There's an administrative process. There's a judicial process. All of those processes are here. The truth is, last time, 4 years ago, Mr. Zell's party was unable to win a single case out of 60, because they were not able to provide a single bit of evidence that persuaded any judge in the country that there are irregularities in the voting. There were no irregularities then. There are none now. And we shouldn't denigrate American democracy by suggesting that. The only reason he's suggesting that is because he thinks Donald Trump's going to lose, and he wants to go and say the same thing again that he said 4 years ago, that the election wasn't free and fair. It is free and fair.
I don't want to go back and debate the 2020 election. Of course, Mark, you might want to have respond to that.
I do want to say, I want to respond to one thing that Mark, I didn't, he suggested that we are somehow we lack confidence in our ability to win this election. The opposite is the truth. And what we are doing, I have to tell you, is the courts in Pennsylvania have been operating, and they have been fixing the problems. That's something that didn't happen in 2020. It's happening now, thank God. They're also opening they tried to keep our poll watchers out of a number of counties. We got them in. We're dealing with these problems now in real time before votes are counted. Right. That's a big improvement.
Okay, so that's good. I want to talk about the Jewish vote in this election, because in some couple of those key swing states, I'm talking Pennsylvania and Michigan primarily, there is a sizable Jewish vote that could impact on it. Now, of course, traditionally, as you pointed out, Mark Zell in Israel, the American Israel public here tends to be more conservative and more favoring to Republicans, and that may well be the case. In the U.S., of course, the American Jewish public has tended to favor the Democrats, usually on a 70-30 advantage. Mark Zell, do you believe that there is a chance for Republicans in this vote to sort of break through that traditional voting pattern and gain some votes that could impact in places, like I say, like Pennsylvania?
Yeah, well, look, first of all, according to the polls, if to the extent you can credit them, the Jewish vote is something now in the United States, something like 60-40 in favor of the Democrats. That's different from the 80-20, 70-30 votes that we've had in the past. That indicates some improvement in that demographic. I think also a lot of from what we're hearing is a lot of the Jewish votes, because of the situation in the Middle East and the reaction of the Democrats abroad, for example, which just collapsed after October 7th in Israel. The entire board resigned because of the failure of the Democratic Party to deal with the issues here in Israel in an effective manner and also deal with anti-Semitism in the United States. I think you're going to see a lot of Jews in America not voting at all. They're not going to vote for Donald Trump in large numbers, but they probably won't. Many of them won't vote for Kamala Harris either. That could have a dispositive impact on the elections as well. So, and then we're getting a lot of people, for example, who have family from here in Israel, and they're being affected. Not only the Jews, but also some of their Christian neighbors are also being very much affected by the overwhelming support for Donald Trump here in Israel. Most of our voters, by the way, when they came here, were registered Democrats, and they changed their mind when they came over and saw things from the Jewish perspective here on this side of the pond.
Now, before I go to Mark Melman, throughout the campaign, both candidates have addressed, for example, Israel's wars against Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. I would think Donald Trump, perhaps more so than Kamala Harris, may be believing, as you suggest, Mark, how the issue plays more to his advantage. Here's what Trump had to say yesterday, campaigning in North Carolina.
And I will stop the chaos in the Middle East. There's another thing, Israel, October 7th. October 7th would have never happened. All of those people that were hostages hopefully are still, because I hope they're of hostage. I just hope they haven't been killed, but I think a lot of them are killed. I think a lot of them have been killed, but we can hope.
Mark Melman, clearly the Republicans believe they might have something of a wedge issue here among American Jewish voters on the issue of Israel, maybe domestic anti-Semitism. How do you respond to that?
The reality is this administration, Biden-Harris administration, is the most pro-Israel administration we've ever had in this country. The reality is more weapons have been shipped to Israel by this administration than any administration in history by a long shot. The reality is that this is only the second time and third time in history that U.S. military assets have been used directly to defend the state of Israel. And that was ordered by President Biden and Vice President Harris. So the reality is this is an extraordinarily pro-Israel administration. American Jews recognize that fact. And if you look at the polls, partisan polls put out by both sides, the objective poll put out by the Congressional Election Study based at Harvard, which has 70,000 interviews nationwide, so a healthy number of Jews in their polling, has 66% of Jews voting for Kamala Harris, 32% for Donald Trump. That is overwhelming support for Kamala Harris. It is some small erosion of support over historical norms, but a very small erosion, again, because I think there is a fundamental recognition on the part of American Jews that this is the most pro-Israel administration we've ever had. Look, we've had Donald Trump talk about ending sanctions against Iran. Just yesterday, he was praising Jill Stein, who's an anti-Israel leader of the Green Party, as his favorite politician in America. This is a guy, even his wives can't count on him to be loyal, let alone a vice president who's willing to hang. Israel can't count on him either.
All right. Now, gentlemen, you both addressed some things going on in the state of Pennsylvania, including Mark Zell. I want to take a listen to a warning which is issued today by the district attorney of Philadelphia, actually against those looking to influence the results from outside the ballot box. Let's take a listen.
But I also want to be clear. Anybody who thinks it's time to play militia, F around and find out. Anybody who thinks it's time to insult, to deride, to mistreat, to threaten people, F around and find out. We do have the cuffs, we do have the jail cells, we do have the Philly juries, and we have the state prisons. So if you're going to try to turn an election into some form of coercion, if you're going to try to bully people, bully votes or voters, you're going to try to erase votes, you're going to try any of that nonsense, we're not playing. F around and find out. That's what we're going to do.
Now, I'm going to ask you both a question about the post-election process. Mark Zell, are Republicans prepared to accept a result in which Donald Trump loses this election? How will they respond if it goes through the courts, and there is a final judgment of Donald Trump losing that election, are Republicans going to accept that result? And
no, the answer to that is yes. It's clearly yes. But I need to say something about what Mark Mellon was talking about, the Biden administration being the most pro-Israel administration in the history of the United States. That's real malarkey. God, come on. You're talking about an administration that, first of all, restarted the relationship with Iran, turns over billions of dollars, reduced sanctions so the Iranians could sell their oil and fund all the terror projects around the region, restored funding to the Palestinian Authority, to UNRWA, and indirectly through Hamas and Hezbollah in the billions of dollars. Also tied Israel's hands in its attempt to respond to the atrocities of October 7th by, first of all, opposing the entry of Israeli ground forces into Gaza, later on opposing the attack on the hospital in Al-Shaba, and then into Khan Yunis, and then into Rafah, where the
Mark, I understand.
That is what happened in the Biden administration, and that's no way you're going to describe that as the most pro-Israel relation. Mark Mellman is living in fantasy land, la la land, when he makes that statement. I've told you that the Republicans will stand by the result of this election, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that Mark and his cronies in Pennsylvania and other places don't get away with the kind of silliness and dangerous interference that they've engaged in, are engaging in, even as we spoke. And here you have the Philadelphia district attorney making, who himself is a George Soros crony, making these
Mark, I want to let Mark Mellman to respond, but I also want to ask you about concern about the future of the Democratic Party, which many people are concerned about in the Jewish community. Not even specifically Kamala Harris, but the influence of the so-called progressive Democratic wing. If Kamala Harris wins, and even more perhaps in some degree if she loses, and American Jewish voters are in some way blamed either by Republicans or Democrats.
Well, I will say Mr. Zell's rant was, like his candidate, completely divorced from reality. But let me leave that to the side and actually try and answer your question. The reality is there is concern about some elements of the Democratic Party. And that's why Democratic Majority for Israel exists, to make sure the Democratic Party remains pro-Israel. We wouldn't exist if there wasn't a problem. There is a problem. But the reality is it's a very small problem. You know, we had over 90% of Democrats in the Congress voting for aid to Israel. We had over 90% of Democrats voting to condemn Hamas, to condemn Hezbollah, to support Israel in this war. So the reality is the vast majority of Democrats are strongly committed to the U.S.-Israel relationship. We went out and tried to defeat those Democrats that were not. We went out and tried to defeat Cori Bush, and we're successful, and Jamal Bowman, and we're successful. The Republicans have done nothing to try and get rid of the anti-Semites on their side. In fact, Donald Trump gave anti-Semites, real anti-Semites, platforms at the Republican National Convention. He praises them. He praises, as I said just yesterday, Jill Stein, leading anti-Israel voice in the United States, praised her as his favorite politician in America. So the reality is the Republicans have done nothing to try and curb the problems on their side. We have problems on our side. We're doing everything we can, fighting the battle to make sure that the Democratic Party remains the strong pro-Israel party that it is. We have a pro-Israel Democratic president, a pro-Israel Democratic vice president, a pro-Israel Democratic leader in the Senate, pro-Israel Democratic leader in the House. And again, over 90% of Democrats in the House and Senate are voting in a pro-Israel way.
Well, gentlemen, I think the one thing certainly you can both agree on is that a strong America is good for Israel and for the world, and a united America is a stronger America. So no matter what the results of this election are going to be, that somehow the U.S. can rally together and move ahead. I want to thank Mark Zell and Mark Mellman for joining us here on Election Day on Honor 24 News. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Gallant. Shalom, shalom.
And let's go back to our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim, joining us from West Palm Beach, Florida. We just heard a very, I would call it a spirited debate between two representatives, Republican, Democrat, both from the sort of, I would say, the Jewish wings of the party, if you want to put that down, Mike. And we should note, in no other election, I think, has Israel, the issue of Israel, and maybe the issue of also being Jewish and anti-Semitism been so prominent in the campaigns and also become so partisan.
Yeah, it's still far down the list for the everyday Americans.
Of course.
They're not paying attention, for the most part, to Israel, Hamas, to anti-Semitism. But, yes, in a broader perspective, it's further up than it has been in the past, certainly. Obviously, because the war is ongoing right now, and the war, not the cause of, but is a domino effect of more anti-Semitism in the United States. So certainly, both parties know there is a price to pay, voting-wise, on the fringe, in the battleground states, in certain districts, if they don't get their messaging right. And I think that, more so than I care about this or I care about that issue, it's more so what is the political consequence that has led the candidates to take certain positions. We see it with both sides. You notice Kamala Harris, it was pointed out, had messaging directed at Pennsylvanians that was pro-Jewish messaging, had messaging directed at Michiganders, pro-Arab, pro-Muslim. Same campaign, two different messages on the same issue, the Israel-Hamas war. And we saw it on the flip side. Elon Musk's PAC, Political Action Committee, in favor of Donald Trump, ran the reverse campaign in those states, trying to send a message on television, on the airwaves, to Michiganders that Kamala Harris is basically anti-Arab, that she's running a pro-Israel campaign and allowing the war to go on. Then he turns around and airs TV ads in Pennsylvania calling Kamala Harris unfit, fomenting anti-Semitism, seeing it on both sides of the equation right now. But both sides realize how consequential it can be politically here on Election Day and in the weeks preceding Election Day to try to get that message right in those particular areas where it can really make a difference.
All right, certainly. And reports of more anecdotal at this stage than actual figures of long lines at the polling stations. It looks like Americans are getting out to vote in this election. We'll see ultimately which side that benefits. Of course, those results won't be coming in for many, many more hours.
Hey, Kalev?
Yes. Mike?
A quick point, by the way, not on subject here, but on the firing of Yoav Gallant, real quick. Recall, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, have their point man. The point man on the other side is Yoav Gallant, together with Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer. It's Gallant that is supposed to be instituting many of the demands on the American side that they put out a 30-day letter for. That 30 days expires next week. And there was a threat that if Israel did not meet those demands, that they were going to face the consequences of possibly losing American military funding. It's going to be consequential now that Gallant is now fired. He's been leading point on all these issues, trying to get on the same page with the Americans. So from an American perspective, there's certainly an effect here down the line within the next week on a very big issue.
Absolutely. We've discussed that early in the program. Mike Wagenheim in West Palm Beach, thank you for that. And Ariel, new details coming out now about how the firing of Yoav Gallant went down.
Yeah, this took place. Gallant was informed 10 minutes before Netanyahu issued the statement, just before the top of the hour. Meeting that took just a few minutes face-to-face, and then Netanyahu issued the statement. Now, according to interesting reporting on Channel 12, Israel's Channel 12 News, Netanyahu is expected to lead alongside new Defense Minister Israel Katz a process of replacing the Chief of Staff of the IDF and other heads of security branches. This wouldn't be too surprising, as the wedge between Netanyahu and those heads of Israel's security branches has become public in recent months. Gallant will deliver a public statement in just over an hour, at 10 o'clock local time, and with the calls for protesters to hit the streets. They're
right.
Ayalon in the south.
We have live pictures, Ariel. We have live pictures.
That's the Ayalon freeway, the main artery of transportation through Tel Aviv. And this isn't the only site that we're getting reports of protest in Israel, also in Jerusalem near the Prime Minister's residence in Aza Street, as well as other areas, other intersections across the country have already been blocked by protesters. So gradually, but not so slowly, the protesters are starting to trickle to the points of demonstration as they usually do across the country every Saturday. This amid the call to hit the streets for a second Gallant night. The first Gallant night was 18 months ago when Gallant was fired the first time. That was reversed. Now this appears to be official.
There is an hour ago, and there's already there's hundreds on the streets.
Right, we see that blocking Ayalon. And this, let's just go out the statement. The head of the political opposition, Yair Lapid, firing Gallant in the middle of the war is an act of madness. Netanyahu is selling Israel's security and the IDF fighters for a disgraceful political survival. The ultra-right-wing government prefers the Dodgers over the servants. I call on the people of Yesh Atid and at Zionist patriots to take to the streets tonight in protest. And as we go out, you will see those protesters building there in Tel Aviv.
Lighting a fire as well.
Yeah. All right, that ends our broadcast for this evening. We'll continue to follow these stories on I-24 News.